facilities for 230,000 Native American homes in need, and 34,000 of those homes are without even potable water. They are the losers. Oil and gas companies and the grazers are the winners in this bill. That's why I'd urge support for the amendment, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman yields back his time. Purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to the amendment offered by my friend and colleague from Virginia. Honoring our nation's obligations to American Indians and Alaskan Natives is an unshakable bipartisan sentiment shared by members of the Interior Appropriations Subcommittee and is an accomplishment in this bill that I am most proud of. This bill increases funding for Indian Health Services by $392 million over the current fiscal year, while everything else, almost virtually everything else, is being cut. A 10% increase that also happens to be one of the rare and by far the largest increases in this bill. This bill includes the same $19 billion cut for sanitation facilities that was proposed by the President, and I note that the President's Indian Health Service budget was an additional $162 million higher than this bill. The problem is the offset. The BLM's management of land resources account has already been cut by $43.5 million below the FY11 and $15.5 million below the President's budget request. This account funds the management of the BLM's more than 245 million surface acres and 700 million subsurface acres. Further cuts to this account are not appropriate. Mr. Chairman, I am proud of the increases we were able to provide in this bill and in previous bills by my predecessors, Mr. Moran and Mr. Dix. You bet I am. Will I continue to fight for more funding for Indian country despite the attacks from virtually every other interest group who isn't happy with their share of the pie? You bet I will. Will I stand by and let my friend and colleague from Virginia continue to systematically dismantle the budget of the largest landowner in the West, the BLM? Absolutely not. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
I move to strike the requisite number of words.
The gentleman from Washington is recognized for 5 minutes.
I ask unanimous consent to revise and extend my remarks.
Without objection.
I support my friend Mr. Moran's amendment, which would increase funding for the Indian Health Service Sanitary Facilities Construction Program. The amendment would provide $18 million for this important health program, which would bring the funding level back up to the enacted level for this year. The offset for this increase comes from a couple of programs that help support the private sector energy and livestock industries. I think this amendment is a very good deal for the American taxpayer. And by the way, these kinds, if you've ever been out in Indian country, one of the problems that they have, I can think of the Skokomish Indians in my district in Mason County, Washington, where they have very serious need for new sanitary facilities. And across Indian country, this is still a major problem. And, you know, there was a group of scientists a few years ago who were asked what was the greatest thing that happened in the 20th century to improve health care. And ironically, they came up with sewers and sanitary facilities was the thing that improved health care around the world most substantially. The Indian Health Service program to construct sanitary facilities that would benefit from this amendment improves the lives of some of our poorest fellow citizens. The Indian Health Service program provides funding for people who often lack basic sanitary facilities, such as the delivery of potable water to their homes. For me, the choice is simple. I urge my colleagues to choose to help provide basic sanitation to Native Americans by making small cuts to programs that assist the energy and livestock industry. This is a good amendment and should be adopted. I yield back the balance of my time.
The gentleman from Washington yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlewoman from Minnesota rise?
I rise to strike the last word, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman from Minnesota is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I rise to also support the Moran Amendment for providing more access to clean drinking water. And to Chairman Simpson's point, we did do a good job working together to significantly improve the quality of life in Indian country. We did that working together. But one area in which some of us felt we could have done a little better is in the area of Indian sanitation. We're seeking to put the funding level back to where this chamber had it in FY11, not a cut. And the way that we're asking to do that, and I'll speak to the issue of grazing because I offered the amendment in full Appropriations Committee, is to ask cattle ranchers to pay a fair fee to graze their cattle. A fee of $1.35 is less, as Mr. Moran pointed out, less than what most states are charging for the use of their public lands. And it is significantly less than some informational gathering that I did that the private sector charges for the use of their lands. When we have our lands at $1.35, not only is it not a benefit to the taxpayers, but it leads to overgrazing of our lands, which does nothing to help improve the quality of public lands for future generation of cattle ranchers. $15 million to grazers in this bill, $4 million to oil and gas. And the numbers again, 230,000 Native American homes without sanitation facilities, 34,000 homes without clean, safe drinking water. No infant, no child in this country or in Indian country should be at risk of intestinal gastrointestinal disease rates that are found in third world countries. Let us provide at the same level of funding that we had in the FY11 bill for Indian sanitation. Let us support clean drinking water for our children. I rise to support this amendment. And I yield back, Mr. Chairman.
The gentlewoman yields back. Who seeks recognition? What purpose does the gentleman from Missouri rise?
The last word.
The gentleman from Missouri is recognized for 5 minutes.
I have an amendment at the desk. Mr. Chairman, in the committee report for this bill, the Appropriations Committee...
The gentleman will suspend. Advise the gentleman that there is a current bill amendment before the committee.
You guys finish.
Gentleman will suspend. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the ayes have it. What purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Ask for the ayes and nays.
Pursuant to Clause 3 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Virginia will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Kansas rise?
At the desk.
The clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr.
I ask unanimous
Camp of
consent the
Kansas.
amendment be considered as read.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Today I rise on behalf of the Republican Study Committee to offer an amendment to bring the Interior Appropriations Bill in line with the RSC budget. Mr. Chairman, credit rating agencies around the country are threatening to downgrade our debt, and not because we won't pass a debt ceiling increase, but more so because we have not passed a credible plan to pay that debt back. Every child born in America today owes the federal government over $46,000, and that bill rises every day. The times we are in demand that we look at the effectiveness of every federal dollar we spend, and that is why I offer this amendment today. This amendment makes cuts across the bill, but the biggest cuts come from the EPA. In my opinion, no agency in our federal government has done more to negatively impact our economy than the EPA. In my district in western Kansas, EPA foot-dragging and red tape is delaying the construction of a new power plant. The construction of the plant would create 1,900 construction jobs and 261 permanent jobs, yet they cannot even break ground. Region 7 is asking for changes. Environmental groups continue to file lawsuits based on EPA rules, exacting a death-by-litigation strategy against the rural electric cooperative members seeking to build this plant. And according to a study by the U.S. Chamber of Commerce, 351 proposed solar, wind, wave, biofuel, coal, gas, nuclear, and energy transmission projects have been delayed or canceled due to significant impediments, such as regulatory barriers, including inefficient review processes and the attendant lawsuits and threats of legal action. The study found that these projects would produce 1.9 million new jobs during construction and almost 800,000 jobs on an ongoing basis. These jobs are simply in limbo when our economy sorely needs them. In fact, not a week seems to go by without the EPA issuing a new rule or regulation that increases the cost to businesses and consumers. Boiler mac, water cooling intakes for power plants, interstate air quality, dust and other particulate matter, ozone, and the list goes on and on. These actions not only drive up cost, but they create higher degrees of uncertainty in our fragile economy. And when the EPA isn't hampering our economy at home, they're sending our tax dollars abroad. Nearly $1.3 million was sent to China in grants over the past 2 years. Yes, that's right. These grants were sent to the China Coal Institute, the China University of Petroleum, the China Urban Construction Design and Research Academy, and the China Association of Rural Energy Industry. I guess the hundreds of billions of dollars of debt we owe them is not enough. The EPA has long given up sound scientific methods to ensure a clean environment for a left-wing agenda that heaps billions in cost on our economy in exchange for nearly immeasurable incremental changes in our water and air quality. Mr. Chairman, this amendment also zeroes out funding for the NEA and the NEH. Federal spending on the arts and humanities has long been controversial, not only for the nature of some of the grants, but also for the fact that I believe the federal government should not play such a role in our society, and certainly should not at a time when we are facing an impending debt crisis. If we cannot make relatively easy decisions to eliminate this funding, how can the American people expect us to make the harder decisions necessary to balance our federal budget? Mr. Chairman, the amendment also ends funding for National Heritage Area grants. This provision was included as a result of the UCUT program, where the American people could vote on a government program to cut, and this is the one they selected. Federal funding for heritage areas was supposed to be seed capital to get them up and running for the states, localities, and the private sector who requested them. Many of the grants have exceeded the original 10-year limitation. Even the President recommended a 50% cut in his budget for them, which was included in the bill. But in this time of much-needed federal spending restraint, it is time to cut them altogether. Mr. Chairman, I encourage my colleagues to pass this amendment and help put us on a track to balance our budget in the next decade. I yield back my time.
The gentleman from Kansas yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Virginia rise?
I rise in strong opposition to this amendment.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes in opposition of the amendment.
Mr. Chairman, this amendment cuts every environmental, conservation, and cultural program across the bill. Totals $3 billion in cuts and then puts those funds in the spending reduction account. The funding in the bill is already grossly inadequate, and this amendment would cut the bill by more than 10%. The amendment zeroes out U.S. fish and wildlife construction by cutting $12 million. It zeroes out U.S. fish and wildlife land acquisition by cutting $15 million. It zeroes out Forest Service land acquisition. It zeroes out the National Endowment for the Arts. It zeroes out the National Endowment of the Humanities. It cuts state and local water infrastructure by $770 million, 30%, even though the infrastructure needs across this country, as Mr. Dix has stated, is $688 billion. This amendment goes on to cut the National Park Service, the Office of the Secretary, Wildland Fire Management, EPA, Science and Technology, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. Mr. Chairman, we should all oppose these draconian cuts. They don't make sense. I don't think the gentleman proposing them necessarily knows what the full impact would be. I suspect, though, that if his constituents, let alone the American people, knew what was being attempted, they would agree with me that this amendment should be soundly defeated, Mr. Chairman.
Yields back.
My time.
What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to join with my good friend from Virginia in speaking against this amendment, although I do appreciate my friend from Kansas in offering it, because this is precisely what would be required if the budget gimmick that was offered by the Republicans last week to restrict funding to 1966 levels, a budget level that was never met by Ronald Reagan, who never proposed a budget that was less than 21%. But this is exactly what would be required. It's why the House is going to demonstrate the schizophrenia on the part of my friends on the other side of the aisle, because this amendment is going to be rejected. I predict it will be rejected, even though that is what they would wish on the American public. Zeroing out the resources for the national humanities, for the NEA, things that are, when push comes to shove, the American public embraces, supports, have dramatic economic impact at home, that leverage private dollars. But this is just the tip of the iceberg. And so I appreciate it being offered. I wish that people would look at it closely, because this is what is being proposed by our Republican friends in their effort going forward. Mr. Chairman, at this point I will yield back, but I do hope people pay close attention to what is embodied here, because this is a taste of what people have in store for the American public.
Gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Strike the last word.
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment, and while I appreciate my good friend from Kansas's passion for cutting spending, the reality is this is exactly what we're doing. This bill comes in we passed a budget earlier in this year on the floor. We're the only body to have passed a budget, actually. The Senate has not passed one yet. But this bill, we were given an allocation, and this bill comes in under that allocation. We all know that we cannot balance this budget simply by cutting. But we also know that reducing federal spending is a necessary priority and a first step toward getting us toward a balanced budget. I think that this amendment goes too far. It would take $3 billion from the numerous accounts in this bill, including the BLM, Fish and Wildlife Service, National Park Service, NEA and NEH, as was mentioned, and transfer it to the budget reduction account. I think it goes too far, because there are, while I appreciate the gentleman's concern that he expressed about the impact that the EPA is having in this country on job creation, and I've said repeatedly that when I go out and give a speech somewhere to a Chamber of Commerce or Lions Club or whatever, I'll talk about the Interior Bill and the agencies that we fund. And when I get to the EPA, someone in the audience will say, just defund it. Get rid of it. And it's the first applause line in the speech. That's the reputation the EPA has out in the public, and that's the concern that the public has about the direction that the EPA is headed. So I appreciate my gentleman's concern about the EPA, but as I try to explain to people, you can't just do away with the EPA. Because if you're out there and you have a business and the underlying law requires you to get an air quality permit or a water permit or something like that, and you call the EPA to get your air quality permit and no one's there to answer the phone to help you with that, then you've got a problem. So we don't want to eliminate the EPA. What we want to do is rein the EPA back in, because I think they've got an overly aggressive agenda. And as I've said, I think they're the biggest wet blanket on the growth in our economy that there is. But I rise in opposition to the amendment, and I would hope that my colleagues would oppose the amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. What purpose does the gentlelady from California rise?
Mr. Chairman, I move to strike the last word to oppose this amendment.
The gentlewoman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, what the American people want from their leaders in Washington can be summed up in a single word: jobs. J-O-B-S. The Republicans have now controlled the House for more than 200 days, and they haven't lifted a finger to address the single overriding priority of the people we work for. That is jobs. It's a gross failure of leadership. Instead of what's on their agenda this week, only the biggest assault on environmental protections in several decades. I have yet, Mr. Chairman, to see a poll where Americans are clamoring for the Congress to undermine pollution controls, damage public health, and unravel a 40-year bipartisan conservation consensus. I can't think of a single environmental program or initiative that is spared under the base legislation, and this amendment makes it even worse. The base bill would mean more toxic mercury, arsenic, and soot pollution released in our air. It leaves the area surrounding the Grand Canyon, an iconic national park, open to toxic uranium mining. It cuts the Land and Water Conservation Fund by 78%. It tears the heart out of the Clean Water Act, and it guts the Endangered Species Act. And it removes those pesky regulatory obstacles that keep pesticides out of our waterways. The Republicans want to block EPA's efforts to protect communities from stormwater runoff and to issue new energy efficiency standards for new vehicles after 2016. Everything we put in place that makes sense is it's what they want to get rid of. And on and on and on and on it goes, Mr. Chairman. One extreme policy writer after another. None of this will do anything to save taxpayers' money. It is an absolute frontal assault on the water we drink, the air we breathe, the public lands we cherish. This is a big special interest giveaway, and that is simple. It's a classic example of legislating to benefit friends and benefactors, big oil and other corporate polluters at the expense of national interests. The nation's natural resources are not ours to exploit at our will. They are on loan to us. We must be the responsible stewards. It will be a moral failure if we don't pass an improved environmental bill, and if we don't pass an environment on to the next generation, one that is in even better condition than the one we have today. But that's what this disgraceful legislation would do. It breaks a covenant that the American people take very seriously, a covenant they actually take for granted. It's Republic extremism run amok on steroids, voraciously rampaging out of control. The base bill, H.R. 2584, must be stopped. This amendment cannot see the day of light. I urge all my colleagues to vote no. I yield back.
California yields back her time. The question's on the amendment offered by the gentleman.
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
I move to strike the requisite number of words.
Gentleman's recognized.
I want to commend Chairman Simpson for opposing this amendment. This is amendment way too far. We've already, under the President's budget request, this budget is $3.8 billion, almost $4 billion below what the President requested. It's $2 billion below the FY11, which we just passed a few weeks ago, and it would have a devastating effect on our environment. When I hear people talk about growing the economy by cutting the budget, I wonder what school of economics they attended. In fact, there was an outstanding article just a few weeks ago in the New York Times that really laid out the basic problem we have in the economy, and that is that consumer spending has dropped by 7%. So we need, and normally in previous recessions it only went down 3%. So then when you cut state and local government funding, when you cut federal funding, you make a bad situation worse in terms of consumption. And that is why the economy has slowed down, and that's why it's going to go up as a result of these kinds of reckless cuts being offered by the other side. Let me give you one example. The Land and Water Conservation Fund, the former administrator from Christine Todd Whitman from New Jersey did a study of what the backlog on wastewater treatment facilities are, and it was $688 billion, and this was in 2002. It's definitely gone up. And yet we're slashing, and would slash again, the amount of money for the Clean Water Revolving Fund and the Safe Drinking Water Revolving Fund and the state and tribal assistance grants. Those are exactly the programs that we should be plussing up in order to get people back to work. It's infrastructure. That's one thing we used to be able to agree on, both Democrats and Republicans in this House, that we need infrastructure work. This will put people to work. How are you going to get the deficit down? Not by slashing government spending. You're going to get it by putting people back to work. When you put them back to work, they start paying taxes, they start buying goods, and that will drive down the deficit. It will drive down unemployment. So what we're here about, and this reckless amendment from the gentleman from Kansas, again, would make this a bad situation even worse in terms of job creation. So I am pleased that the majority is resisting this ill-thought-out amendment, and I urge its defeat.
Gentleman yields back.
I yield back.
The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas. Those in favor say aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it. What purpose does the gentleman from Kansas rise?
Ask for the ayes and nays.
Does the gentleman ask for a recorded vote?
Yes, sir.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Kansas will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Missouri rise?
Mr. Chairman, I have an amendment at the desk.
Clerk will report the amendment.
Amendment offered by Mr. Cleaver of Missouri, page 2, line 20. After the dollar amount, insert reduced by $3 million. Page 65, line 19. After the dollar amount, insert increased by $3 million.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, in the committee report for this bill, the Appropriations Committee included some language expressing concerns in regard to the Environmental Protection Agency's Urban Waters Initiative and provides no funding in the bill for this program for fiscal year 2012. I understand the committee's reluctance to extend funding for new broad cross-cutting initiatives, given our economic situation. However, I feel this initiative has immense value to millions of people who live in urban centers and who rely on the government to ensure that they have clean water to drink and use in their daily lives. This amendment would restore partial funding for the Urban Waters Initiative for fiscal year 2012. This amendment does not increase the spending by one single penny. Cities share one key characteristic. They're full of people, buildings, and businesses. Because everyone shares the same relative space, air and water, environmental impacts are concentrated in small areas, including waterways. Urban waters take on large amounts of pollution from a variety of sources, including industrial discharges, mobile sources, such as cars and trucks, residential, commercial, wastewater, trash, and polluted stormwater runoff from urban landscapes. As urban pollutions often share centralized water sources, this pollution creates public and environmental health hazards like lower drinking water quality and water bodies that aren't safe for human swimming. The EPA launched the Urban Waters Program to address water quality challenges in the urban watersheds and build capacity of disadvantaged communities through projects that revitalize these watersheds. If maintained properly, urban waters can also yield positive impacts for populations in both urban and upstream communities. Revitalization of waterways can spur employment.
Will suspend. Pursuant to the Chair's announcement of earlier today, the House will now observe a moment of silence in memory of Officer Jacob J. Chestnut and Detective John M. Gibson. Will all present please rise for a moment of silence. The gentleman may proceed.
Mr. Chairman. Communities across the country are coming together, working with the EPA, state and local agencies, and taking steps to access, restore, and benefit from their urban waters and the surrounding lands. My Missouri 5 district, a large section of which is Kansas City, is one such community. The EPA regional staff are working with the Kansas City and local citizens groups to monitor water supply and plan and conduct improvements to the Blue River watershed and Brush Creek. Covering 270 square miles, the Blue River comprises the largest watershed in the greater Kansas City metropolitan area. Its drainage is divided between the states of Kansas and Missouri and flows through 3 counties, 12 cities, and 10 school districts. Brush Creek is the most visible tributary to the Blue River and runs completely through an area that we are trying to rebuild called the Green Impact Zone. The EPA is monitoring water quality along the watershed and assisting in local efforts to conduct large-scale watershed planning for Brush Creek and the Blue River. Whether as a part of a cleanup leading to waterfront development or putting monitoring in place to ensure safe drinking water with the EPA's help, community groups across the country have taken the initiative, engaging volunteers, community organizations, and local and state government to make their waters safe for many uses. This amendment provides $3 million for urban waters within the EPA's environmental programs and management account, though it is by no means the maximum amount of funds that this program could utilize. It will ensure that this vital community-driven initiative can continue, and I ask for the approval of this amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. Who seeks recognition? Gentleman from Idaho.
Move to strike last word.
Recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I rise in opposition to this amendment. The amendment would take $3 million from the BLM Management of Lands and Resources and transfer it to the EPA's Urban Water Initiative. The BLM Management of Lands and Resources account has already been cut by $43.5 million below the FY11 and $15.5 million below the President's budget request. This account funds the management of the BLM's more than 245 million surface acres and 700 million subsurface acres. Further cuts to this account would not be appropriate. We eliminated funding for the EPA's new Urban Waters Initiative because it was duplicative funding. Regardless of whether a water body is in an urban or a rural area, EPA and states should be addressing the most impaired waters first, and there are a number of well-established programs that handle that. There is no need for a separate duplicative initiative in order to protect our urban waters. It only results in duplicative spending. I urge my colleagues to vote no on this amendment.
The gentleman yields back his time. Gentleman from Virginia.
I move to strike the last word.
Gentleman from Virginia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I support the distinguished gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver's amendment, to add a modest $3 million to the Environmental Protection Agency for the Urban Water Initiative, which the subcommittee refused to fund. EPA and the Department of the Interior announced the first pilots of this program last month. They included Baltimore's Patapsco watershed, the Anacostia watershed in the District of Columbia and Maryland, the Bronx and Harlem River watersheds in New York, the South Platte River in Denver, the Los Angeles River watershed, the Lake Pontchartrain area in New Orleans, and the Northwest Indiana area. All areas in drastic need of attention. The subcommittee report chides EPA for reprioritizing funds to begin the program in fiscal year 2011 without the express approval of the committee. But my friends should know that when you fund the government under a continuing resolution, the agency has more flexibility. We don't want EPA or any other agency to decide how to prioritize funding, then we should pass real bills. And frankly, they did exactly the right thing in moving forward with this Urban Water Initiative. That's where the need is. Furthermore, denying funds to urban watersheds where a majority of our population lives because of a dislike for all things EPA is simply unfair to these urban communities. On a bipartisan basis, we've worked together to provide needed funding for rural water programs. We agree that should be a priority, but we should also show the same level of commitment for the Urban Waters Initiative. This program will also capitalize on work being done through EPA's broader geographic programs, such as Chesapeake Bay and Lake Pontchartrain. These are two very critical water bodies that are endangered.
I don't think we need to get into the extent of the endangerment for Chesapeake Bay and certainly not Lake Pontchartrain. Imagine, just think back to what happened in New Orleans just a few years ago. This offset is from the management account of the Bureau of Land Management, which is adequately funded in the bill. So I really do support this amendment. And I would urge all of my colleagues to do the same, and I'd be happy to yield to the gentleman from Washington State.
I just want to associate myself with the gentleman's remark. I support this amendment. I can think back when I was going to the University of Washington, and when Lake Washington, which is between Seattle and Bellevue, was completely polluted, and you couldn't swim in it. And then the people there bonded themselves and completely restored the lake. And today, that is some of the most valuable property in the entire Pacific Northwest. So these urban water initiatives are critically important for the environment, for the health of the people of those areas, and I think this is a modest amendment, and I urge our colleagues to accept it.
I very much thank the distinguished ranking member of the Full Appropriations Committee. At this point, I would yield back my time.
The gentleman from Virginia yields back his time. The question is on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri, Mr. Cleaver. Those in favor say aye. Aye. Those opposed, no. In the opinion of the chair, the noes have it.
Mr. Chairman.
Gentleman from Virginia.
We would ask for a recorded vote on this.
Pursuant to Clause 6 of Rule 18, further proceedings on the amendment offered by the gentleman from Missouri will be postponed. What purpose does the gentleman from Washington rise?
Strike the requisite number of words, address House 5 minutes.
Without objection, the gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Speaker, it is true that no bill is perfect, but this bill is truly atrocious. And I've come here as co-chair of the Sustainable Energy and Environment Caucus Coalition to talk about how this bill represents a wholesale failure to really recognize our stewardship responsibilities of the greatness of this country. And it is a great country. I fly across it every Monday and Friday, and the words of the song that God's grace were shed on thee in this country are really true. But this bill shows nothing but disdain for the precious assets of clean air, clean water, and good open ground that we have in this country. And I'm sad to say that when you look out across America today, you'll see Republicans and Democrats out recreating. They understand what a beautiful playground we have in our national lands and clean water. But right now, all this bill is a playground for the special interests. And it's sad to say that a party that we have worked with historically has now turned its back on this stewardship responsibility. Teddy Roosevelt, that started this effort, would be rolling over in his grave to see this wholesale abandonment of this stewardship responsibility of this great country. Republicans and Democrats alike want more clean air. This bill gives them less. They want more clean water. This bill gives them less. They want more open, good ground. This bill gives them less. And the reason is it's based on a huge mistaken belief that dirty air is good for our economy, that dirty water is good for our economy, and that despoiled land is good for our economy. These are falsehoods. You know, you want to talk about job creation. I'd like to talk about some jobs we would like to create and keep that are damaged by this bill. Right now in Puget Sound out in Washington State, we historically have grown some of the best oysters in the world, in Hood Canal and other places. And now, because of water pollution, the oyster industry that employs thousands of people in my state is endangered by water pollution. Now, one would think when we're trying to protect jobs in every industry, including the oyster industry, we might be interested in preventing pollution that destroys a whole industry. But no, that's not what this bill does. This bill weakens our ability to protect against dirty water and storm water pollution, which is endangering jobs in my state, and in other places in this country. Now, if you go to talk to the people in this industry, they'll say their jobs are important. But according to this bill, they are not. What's important are the special interests and the ability to degrade our environmental protection. Take a look at the alternative fuels industry that is now growing across this country and their ability to create millions of new jobs. A few weeks ago, I was at a company called Targeted Growth. Targeted Growth, a few years ago, had an idea of creating biofuels that we could fly airplanes in. And 5 years ago, people thought this was a pipe dream. But because of their intellectual prowess, just a few weeks ago, using a Targeted Growth biofuels, we flew the first transoceanic flight using biofuels from camelina that can be grown in my state and refined in my state, first time in American history. That's something to be proud of. Now, one would think in a bill like this, we would help new job-creating industries like that get started. But no, what this bill does is degrade the clean energy parts of our law that would give inspiration and additional innovation and investment in these clean energy industries. This bill is an anti-job creation bill because it makes the assumption that dirty air and sick people are good for economic growth. And that is not a recipe for economic growth in this country. Now, I'll just talk about one thing. There's been an 80% reduction in our Land and Conservation Water Fund, which is very disturbing, should be to Republicans and Democrats alike. This is one thing I hope we can fix in this bill, and it's not something that is so urban or rural. I think about this, a little city park in Mossy Rock, Washington, that a police officer said, why do I get all these kids hanging around the bars? Let's get them in something, get them off the streets. And using some of these funds, we now got a city park being built in Mossy Rock, Washington. Is that such a dangerous thing for our economy? And I hope Representative Bass' amendment is successful later on so that we can, in fact, fix at least one thing in this bill. Otherwise, reject this bill.
Gentleman's time has expired. What purpose does the gentleman from Oregon rise?
Move to strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman, I take modest exception to the comments of my good friend from the state of Washington because having read Wilderness Warrior about Teddy Roosevelt, there's no doubt that TR is spinning in his grave. And this Interior Environment Appropriations Bill represents an abdication of responsibility on the part of the federal government. Not only does the bill cut funding for clean air, clean water, and protection of public lands, it's polluted with anti-environmental riders. These riders have nothing to do with reducing the deficit and everything to do with undermining the role of the federal government in protecting our nation's environment and public health. This bill is a partisan attack on 40 years of progress to protect the health and environment. It places profit-seeking interests of large polluters over the health of the American public, privatizing the benefits while forcing the children and elderly to bear increased health care costs. Most of all, this bill is a waste of time. In the midst of a looming debt crisis, we're engaged in a rhetorical debate about legislation that moves us backward and will never become law, either defeated in the Senate or vetoed by the President. Republicans are risking the stability of our economy for the opportunity to demonstrate once again they're more concerned about protecting industry profits than the American people. In the midst of a heat wave in Washington, D.C. and around the country, the bill pretends that climate change isn't happening and even prevents the EPA from following the law and a Supreme Court decision to reduce greenhouse gas emissions. It threatens 2 million jobs and over $363 billion of the nation's economy that depends on the support of the programs of the Department of Interior. There are devastating cuts to clean water and clean state revolving funds. The Water and Conservation Fund, as is referenced, 80% cut, the most dramatic reduction in 45 years. It cuts EPA's operating budget, oversight budget for offshore drilling, and more will leave the communities around the country struggling to provide services to their citizens and even comply with federal laws. In Oregon, the cuts to public lands funding will mean missed opportunities to protect special places like the Columbia River Gorge. It also will cripple local economies. Studies have shown that for every $1 billion invested in water infrastructure, between 20,000 and 26,000 jobs are created. It cuts almost $1 billion from the state revolving fund, which helps states finance federally mandated upgrades and repairs to water and sewer systems. It will put additional pressure on already tight local budgets, as well as potentially increasing water and sewer rates, and in communities like mine, we've seen them skyrocket in recent years. The bill rolls back life-saving and cost-saving measures under the Clean Air Act and other environmental laws, which were enacted to protect the health and the environment of the American people. It should be no surprise that it's cheaper and easier to prevent toxics like mercury and arsenic from going into our water and air in the first place than try and remove them later. The EPA studies show that the benefits far outweigh the costs. There's no doubt one of the reasons why a number of public health organizations, including the American Lung Association, the American Public Health Association, the American Academy of Pediatrics, have all written to Congress opposing these clean air policy riders. The policy riders in this spending bill can only be described as fulfilling a special interest wish list. From blocking clean air regulations and oversight of mining, to preventing federal action to clarify the jurisdiction of the Clean Water Act, to a new moratorium on listings under the Endangered Species Act, the bill countless times ignores the needs of our communities and instead implements what polluting industries have been asking for. Why are we talking about allowing new mining around the Grand Canyon? Finally, most paradoxically, this bill restricts the funding for the EPA Office of Sustainable Communities. Now, this is an office that provides technical and assistance to local communities who wish to plan for increased economic growth and development and account for the changes in their community and the demographic impacts. This office has been in existence for over 15 years. It is an extraordinarily useful tool to help communities understand how to put the pieces together, how to coax more value. The demand is so high for their services, they can only help 9% of the applicants. Now would not be the time, it would seem, to make it harder for communities who want to encourage economic development and growth in a thoughtful and sustainable fashion. I urge my colleagues to vote against this bill. We can and must do better for our communities.
The gentleman yields back his time.
Mr. Chairman.
What purpose does the gentleman from Idaho rise?
Move to strike the last word for the purpose
Gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Yield to the gentleman from New York for the purpose of a colloquy.
Thank you. I would like to enter into a colloquy with the distinguished chairman of the Interior Appropriations Committee.
I'd be happy to do so.
Mr. Chairman, during our full committee markup on the Interior bill, Congressman Latourette offered an amendment to prevent the Great Lakes states from receiving any EPA funding if they have implemented ballast water rules that are stronger timelines or standards than the federal or international requirements that are currently in effect. At the time, Mr. Chairman, I asked that we look more thoughtfully at the potential impact this amendment might have. Since that markup, I have heard concerns from numerous groups and from the state of New York. In addition, it is my understanding that both EPA and the Coast Guard are working towards finalizing national standards. Would you be willing, as we move towards conference with the Senate, to work with New York members, Congressman Latourette, and other Great Lakes members to help us find a workable solution to this problem of invasive species and ballast water discharges?
I thank the gentleman for his question. The gentleman from New York has spoken to me about these concerns, and I am aware that this is a serious issue that will have an immediate impact on the state of New York and other Great Lakes states. Before conference, I will work with you, Congressman Latourette, and other Great Lake members to try and resolve these concerns.
I'd like to thank the chairman for your assistance.
And yield.
I'd yield to the gentleman.
I thank you very much. And I want to commend Mr. Serrano of New York for the reasoned and balanced approach he's taken to this. Rather than filing a knee-jerk reaction either in committee or now on the floor, he has recommitted to working together to solve this problem. It's a problem that needs to be solved, and I just want the record to be clear. In 2008, New York, the New York Department of Environmental Conservation, not the state legislature, not the state, enacted ballast water exchange regulations that would have gone into effect had they pushed the issue that are 100 times more stringent than the international standard and would have gone to 1,000 times more stringent a year after that. And only 2 states, New York and also Minnesota, had something in their regulations called innocent passage, and that is it applies to all ships that just pass through New York's water, whether they take on ballast water or discharge ballast water or whatever. The difficulty is, and I take a back seat to no one in this Congress on the issue of invasive species in the Great Lakes. My first piece of legislation I wrote with Senator John Glenn, the invasive species legislation in 1996, but this particular provision by the New York Port Authority would cripple and perhaps eliminate commerce on the Great Lakes. So this deserves thoughtful consideration. It deserves our study, and I would again commit to the gentleman from New York, Mr. Serrano, to work with you and the chairman to find a way that solves this horrible problem of invasive species in ballast water or anything else, but doesn't stop interstate commerce on the Great Lakes. And I yield back and I thank you.
Thank you. I yield back the balance of my time.
For what purpose does the gentleman from California rise?
To strike the last word.
The gentleman is recognized for 5 minutes.
Mr. Chairman and my colleagues, I rise in strong opposition to this bill. I hope the press and the American people are paying attention to what's going on the House floor. I know the news is all about raising the debt ceiling and all the cuts or revenues that might be involved before we can get legislation to do something that has been routinely done, almost automatically done, every year or two for decades. But what is happening on the House floor deserves the attention of the American people. This is the most anti-environmental House of Representatives in history. The new Republican majority seems intent on restoring the Robert Baron era, where there were no controls on pollution from power plants, oil refineries, and factories. This year, we've witnessed weather disaster after weather disaster. There have been massive floods, record-breaking fires, record-breaking droughts, and now record-breaking heat waves. Yet earlier this year, the House passed a bill that repealed EPA's scientific finding that climate change is occurring, is caused by man, and is a serious threat. We don't hear about the connection between these weather events and climate change and carbon emissions. We're not hearing from it when we watch the daily news shows, and we're not hearing it from this administration. I just sent recently a letter to Secretary Chu, the Secretary of Energy, a Nobel Prize winner, asking him to speak out. We need to educate the American people so we can educate our colleagues here in the House of Representatives. In this bill, the Republican majority wants to block EPA from issuing regulations to reduce carbon emissions from power plants and oil refineries that are causing this catastrophic climate change. The majority also wants to block regulations to cut carbon pollution from motor vehicles, even though these regulations help break our dangerous dependence on oil, save American families money, and clean the air we breathe. This House can deny science. We can amend our nation's laws, but we cannot rewrite the laws of nature. The longer we ignore the scientific reality that our actions are destabilizing the environment, destabilizing our climate, the more costly and disruptive our response will need to be, and the more we endanger our children's future. When we were debating carbon regulations earlier this year, my colleagues on the other side of the aisle claimed that they supported reductions in what they call real air pollution, whatever that means. But it turns out they are gutting those protections as well. This legislation includes a provision that will block landmark rules to protect the health of our children by cutting air pollution and reducing toxic mercury pollution. The bill blocks cross-state air pollution rules, an important rule that is designed to prevent dirty power plants in one state from contributing to air quality problems in other downwind states.
EPA estimates that this rule will prevent up to 34,000 premature deaths and nearly 2 million sick days a year beginning in 2014. The bill indefinitely delays mercury and air toxic standards for power plants. Mercury is a potent neurotoxin that damages brain developments in infants and children, impairing our ability to think and learn. EPA's mercury rule will clean up this pollution and prevent 17,000 premature deaths each year. Republicans like to argue that environmental regulations must be justified by a rigorous cost-benefit analysis. Well, these regulations have been thoroughly analyzed, and their benefits are 10 times greater than their costs, and yet they want to stop those regulations from going into place. These essential health protections are not being targeted because they are too costly. They are being targeted because they are opposed by powerful special interests like oil companies and electric utilities. We need to stop putting the special interest ahead of the public interest. This bill poses a choice. Are we for protecting pregnant women, infants, and children from toxic pollution, or are we for protecting the profits of special interests? A strong and vital EPA is in our national interest and the public interest. If we disarm EPA, as this bill would do, there is no one to stand up to the
gentleman's time has expired.
And protect American
For what
families.
purpose does the gentlelady from California rise? Gentlelady is recognized for 5 minutes.
I rise today in strong opposition to the 2012 Interior Appropriations Bill, the most anti-environment bill I've seen on the House floor since I was elected to Congress. If this bill passes, our air will be more polluted, our water will be dirtier, and we know that much of what we love will disappear. This bill rolls back the clock to a time when big companies could poison our streams and rivers with impunity, when power plants could freely contaminate the air we breathe, and when our national treasures were destroyed by corporations, all for a bigger profit. First, the bill slashes funding to the EPA by $1.8 billion, stealing funding that keeps our drinking water and wastewater systems clean. Then, it guts the Land and Water Conservation Fund. This program has done more than any other to expand local parks, recreational green spaces, and public lands enjoyed by hundreds of millions of Americans. Well, this bill cuts this program by 80% to its lowest level in history, nearly eliminating efforts to ensure that our treasured places are protected for families to enjoy for generations to come. Then it abolishes the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration Climate Service, which is crucial to understanding how the changes in our national climate affect our farms, coastal communities, and businesses. Finally, it proposes crippling cuts to the development of renewable energy sources and energy efficiency, only making our nation more dependent on importing oil and gas from foreign countries. But you know what's worse of all is that these cuts severely jeopardize the 1.5 million jobs that could be created as a result of American clean energy innovation and undermine growth in our nation's clean tech industries. And even though some are calling this a cost-cutting bill, it's really a bill to pad the pockets of big corporations and the worst polluters. Unbelievably, it gives away $55 million in subsidies to oil and gas companies and blocks the necessary increase in fees to inspect oil and gas stations from disasters like the BP Gulf spill. And that's not all. The bill includes 39 different environmental policy bans that open up our natural resources to greedy polluters and keep our environmental agencies from doing their jobs to protect us from contamination. It allows more soot pollution in our air by blocking critical public health standards that ensure our air is very healthy for Americans to breathe. It blocks the EPA from implementing greenhouse gas pollution standards for new cars in 5 years from now, jeopardizing 700,000 new jobs and the estimated 2.4 million barrels of oil a day saved in just 2 decades. It prohibits my home state of California from moving ahead with its own clean air standard. It exempts oil companies from complying with Clean Air Act standards for offshore drilling, again protecting the special interests of big oil. It puts the drinking water of 117 million Americans at risk by blocking EPA from keeping our water clean in half of America's streams and some 20 million acres of wetlands. It allows unregulated discharge of pesticides directly into our rivers and lakes. This bill is a direct attack, a declaration of war on our air, water, wildlife, and wildlands. It is clear that this bill isn't about cutting spending. It's about cutting years off our children's lives by increasing their exposure to contaminants in the air and water. The Republicans are putting polluters ahead of the health and safety of the American people. I urge my colleagues to oppose this bill.